This is day one. For the people is the theme ahead of the Biden speech tonight. We got a great panel of experts who are on standby, and we're going to bring them in just a moment to talk about what the political dynamics are going into tonight. As you know, and I've said it many, many times, that the Democratic Party looks much different than it did 1 month ago. And so we'll be breaking down some of those key factors going into tonight. Remember, tonight may have looked very, very different than what it is right now. So let's do that. Let's bring into the conversation here our friends at the New York Post, A.G. Gancarski, but also political analyst Brian Sobel. They have been helping us make sense of this political season, and they join us in just a moment. Like I said, you're watching the stage there. It is set. Speakers will be happening in just no time here, and let's bring them into the conversation. All right, A.G., Brian, thanks for being with us here. Let's get right to it. You were just watching what's happening outside the United Center. These Gaza war protesters, some of them have breached one of these fences there in the security perimeter. Many of them have been shouting, "Genocide Joe." Brian, I'll start with you. Does this take away from the overall message that Democrats are trying to project this week, that they're a united party in the wake of Biden withdrawing from the ticket almost exactly a month ago? Brian, does everything happening outside negate that message?
No, not at all. I think you've got what was expected, which is these protests. Had this been a Republican convention and a Republican president who was in the same position as Joe Biden in terms of supporting Israel and helping to prosecute a war and all of that, you'd have the protests at the Republican convention. So this is not not a surprise to see this. It'll be interesting to see how much they want to test the police there in Chicago. And of course, for any student of history, you go back to the 1968 Democrat convention in Chicago that ended up being one of the most violent in American history. So obviously, Chicago is holding its breath tonight, hoping, and over the next 4 days, hoping that history is not repeated.
So, A.G., though, to underscore the point of the question I just asked Brian, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman, he won't be attending the DNC at all this week. He's been a proponent of how Israel has been prosecuting this war, one of the Democratic Party's main backers of the state of Israel on Capitol Hill. He's not going to be there. Does that underscore the point of my question, A.G.?
It brings out an interesting contrast, and I would mention that Fetterman's own comms person undercut his position on Israel just today. So, it kind of shows the divide in the Democratic Party between the elected officials and the activist youth who, take a more nuanced, equivocating position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Kamala Harris is in a tough spot here. I mean, yes, these protests were inevitable, but they really do speak to, the idea that there's this quiet among the younger people on the left, that she's got to find a way to reconcile, while appealing to independent voters. So Kamala Harris, I mean, she's talking about joy as a big leitmotif of her campaign, but this is the opposite of joy that we're seeing in Chicago. We're seeing protests like we haven't seen in many years of these conventions. And Harris has been very vague on what she would actually do to effectuate change in that conflict. She's made comments at rallies, but her inability to do an interview with reporters after 4 weeks as a candidate, is really glaring here, because this is a situation that calls for Kamala Harris to address it, to say what U.S. policy should be going forward, to send a message to all sides in the conflict and to the domestic people who are agitated by it.
Yeah, of course, this is coming as well on the news that Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's in Israel as we speak, he met today with the Israeli defense minister, and he said today Israel had accepted the latest U.S.-backed proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza. He also says it's now up to Hamas to agree to the plan. Over the weekend, we brought our viewers the news. Hamas rejected the latest iteration of the proposal. We'll see if they come back to the table after this news today there. So this issue is going to be front and center throughout the course of the next 4 days. Brian, AG, though, let's talk about President Biden. He's speaking on the first night of the convention. We can get into if there's any symbolism to that, Brian, in just a moment. Is this Biden's swan song, so to speak? Is he all but exiting stage left of the Democratic Party? They're thanking him for 50 years of public service to the nation tonight. But he's going to be president, Brian and AG, for the next 5 months. How would you characterize this moment, Brian? The incumbent isn't the incumbent anymore. Is that an apt characterization, even though Biden has 5 more months of the presidency?
Absolutely. And the reason why they have him on the first night is to get him out of the picture. Clearly, he would be a distraction if he showed up tomorrow night or over the next 3 days. So they want to give him his due, give him his standing ovation, and exit him stage left. That's the theme tonight. There's going to be a ton of speeches, as we know from looking at the lineup for tonight, but it concludes with the president, and I think the president will then go off for the next few months and finish out his term while the rest of the nation decides what's next, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump.
You know, AG and Brian even, we had talked about this extensively over the last few months, how this week could have gone so differently in the run-up to Biden dropping out. We really didn't know how the DNC would look, whether it would have been a contested convention or an open convention. That was all contingent on what President Biden wanted and did in the wake of dropping out now almost exactly a month ago. I know hindsight is 2020, or you could say 2024 at this point. Were you surprised, though, AG, at how fast Democrats pulled this off and pulled this together, meaning the convention? Remember, before Biden dropped out, we were expecting a virtual roll call. The roll call will be tomorrow in person here. So just give our viewers a sense of how this could have all gone so differently this week and the massive fundamental change within the Democratic Party in just a month's time. This is a very, very fast turnaround for a party here. Is it unified going into tonight, coalescing so fast around Harris as the nominee? AG.
Yeah, I mean, polling suggests that it is. You look at state polling like I do every day for the Post. She's at 95% with Democrats. You kind of wonder if she's topped out with them, in fact. And, this is because party leaders, they took a very dogged view. They basically encouraged the president to get out of the race after that disastrous debate in June. He eventually did that. And, the endorsements came in from virtually every party leader. Barack Obama was last, but a lot of people were before him. And basically it was something where Kamala Harris became the inevitable candidate. The other people, J.B. Pritzker, Josh Shapiro, other people who were talked about as potential presidential candidates said they weren't interested. That also cleared the path. And it was very important for Democrats to pull this off, because I think an open convention, a contested convention, something like that, it would have stopped fundraising for, Harris and other Democrats. And Harris has been a really dominant fundraiser since she's entered this race. So they wanted to keep that momentum going. The question is now you got almost a postmodern candidate, which is all vibes and, subjective claims and a lot of making you feel better than Donald Trump does. But, they've done everything but fill in what Kamala Harris would do as president. We know nothing about, her individual tax policy. We know a little bit about her corporate tax policy. She wants to raise taxes on corporations. But there's so much that we don't know about Kamala Harris. And I think the American people want answers. They're not going to get those answers this week.
Okay.
But they're going to want those answers before they vote.
Okay, To AG's point, Brian, that's somewhat of a paradox. Why don't we know that much about Kamala Harris? I mean, she's been a senator from California. She ran for president in 2019. She's been the vice president for 3.5 years, almost four. And you hear so often in the last month how Kamala Harris has had to redefine herself when you put her up against other members of the Democratic Party, when you put her up against previous policy positions that she has taken here, but also when you put her up against President Biden himself here. Do you anticipate, Brian, that there's going to be any chasms or any departures between Harris and Biden when it comes to policy? Is that an inevitability, or will she hew to Biden pretty closely on policy? Or in the next, 80 days or so, will she radically depart on issues like, abortion or the Gaza war or other issues here? What do you think about that question? How has Harris done defining herself and or redefining herself, Brian?
Well, I'll take the last question, and that is that, over 3.5 years, she hasn't defined herself very well, but that's typical of vice presidents. She has been running around the country, basically supporting the Biden agenda, which in and of itself is not all that clear. Her job now over the next 70-some days is to define herself. Now, I'm based in California, so I'm very familiar with Kamala Harris. I've watched her through her iterations in elected politics and appointed positions, but that doesn't translate to the nation. And so she has to, through this convention this week, but post-convention, she has to get out and start talking to the American people about who she is and what she believes. And to the earlier point, which is really on point, the fact that she's been able to dodge media interviews since she announced is unconscionable, really. I mean, I don't understand why the mainstream media is just not hammering her every day on the point that she isn't taking media interviews. Now, we are starting to see editorials and other things popping up around the country saying, hey, time to start telling the American people who you are and what you're going to bring to the program. But that hasn't happened yet. So we may see more definition over the next 4 days, but maybe not. Might be just a lot of platitudes, which we often see in these kinds of conventions.
Brian, that's such a good point, too. And many from her campaign had said that they're potentially waiting for the DNC to be over before she does some of these major, maybe one-on-one sit-down interviews. She has spoken briefly, to the press off the cuff when they're traveling with her, very briefly, albeit nothing important or with weight just yet. And we've heard from the camp that might be coming sometime at the end of this month here. But I just want to walk our viewers back because I want to hammer the point here that the DNC really looked so different a month and a half ago. Biden was still at the top of the ticket. Of course, he is no longer here. Let's just take a moment, and AG, I'll let you kind of opine on this. This was a massive change, not only for the Democratic Party, but for the country here. You have the current president. He's speaking on night one of his own party's convention. He and the First Lady, they're headed to California for a week after this. He won't even be there for the Harris-Walz nomination acceptance speeches on Thursday. I mean, is Biden literally going off into the sunset here? Is his political career, his political obituary, if you will, being written right now, AG?
Yes, I believe so. We probably have a couple of October surprises coming down the stretch from the Biden administration. But, his lack of a real public role beyond tonight in this campaign is a red flag. And it's different from, say, Reagan, in 1988, Bill Clinton in 2000, Barack Obama in 2016. This is unprecedented, where you have a president who basically is on the sidelines. And it kind of validates the critiques that you hear that, perhaps Biden didn't want to leave the race after all. He definitely wanted to hold on to this. He wanted to run for a second term until he didn't. And, that's kind of the question here is people are going to ask, how involved is Kamala Harris in the Biden administration's decision making? We've heard varying things. We've heard that she was, right there when the decision was made to withdraw from Afghanistan, which turned out to be disastrous given the abandonment of the military equipment over there. Other issues as well. We've seen the reversal on the so-called border czar designation. So there are a lot of questions about Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and whether this is a co-presidency at this point, whether Joe Biden's still calling the shots, or whether Kamala Harris is basically the de facto incumbent.
Yeah.
And this comes back again to the Democratic establishment just not being clear, the media not pressing hard enough to get answers from Harris about what she believes and what she would change in her own term. If these questions are not answered, independent voters are going to get squeamish.
Okay, Brian and AG, I want to talk as well about how Republicans are counter-programming this week. I thought it was really interesting timing today from House lawmakers on the GOP side. They released their report on the Biden impeachment inquiry. And just have to remind our viewers, maybe they forgot, but this has been ongoing there, not only at the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, but also at the House Judiciary Committee and House Ways and Means. Looking into some of these allegations, compiling a report, making public the report today, and it said as follows, that Biden engaged in, quote, impeachable conduct, House Republicans found in their months-long impeachment inquiry, declaring in their highly anticipated report that he, quote, unquote, abused his office and, quote, unquote, defrauded the United States to enrich his family. This was a 292-page report prepared by those various committees here. So you want to talk about timing, you want to talk about counter-programming. House Republican lawmakers decided this was the day to release this. But, Brian, Biden's not getting impeached anytime soon. That somewhat fell flat. The report, though, stands.
Geez, there's a shocker. The idea that anybody should continue to talk about Joe Biden is a waste of time. Even the Democrats, as we were talking about earlier, and to AG's point and all of that, is, thank you, Mr. President, don't let the door hit you on your way out. And that's where it stands. And so to continue to litigate Joe Biden's time in office is missing the point, in my view, for Republicans. They have to focus on Kamala Harris, on what she stands for and doesn't stand for, on clarifying her record, because anytime you talk about Joe Biden at this point, it's a waste of breath, in my view, because he is effectually not the president that we have come to expect from presidents. And to the point about earlier about whether Kamala is a co-president or not, we only have to look at history. Presidents and vice presidents have their own staffs. Probably the most important person in Washington, D.C. right now is Biden's chief of staff or people that are close to him. Those are the people that are making day-to-day decisions. And historically, vice presidents, the office of the vice president and the office of the president don't communicate very well. And I haven't seen great communication between these two presidents, between the president and the vice president either. So that's just history. And I don't think there's anything that leads us to believe anything is different with this administration.
AG, I wanted to ask you, too, I know you followed the Trump campaign pretty closely. How do you think Trump has maneuvered and navigated now running against Vice President Kamala Harris? He has a few nicknames for her. He's been calling her Comrade Kamala. He's been referring to now Bidenomics as Kamalanomics. He has said that Kamala Harris is more liberal than Bernie Sanders. Is the Trump campaign having trouble landing an attack line? Is any of this sticking here, or have they really had to shift?
Yeah, I don't think they've been successful in recalibrating their messaging. The story, when you had to change the top of the ticket, was that Trump prepared to run against Joe Biden, and he's been doing that for years. And, Kamala Harris was a curveball. And it doesn't feel like that, the Trump campaign's been particularly adroit in recalibrating. The contrast between Trump and Harris are not favorable to Trump necessarily. The age question that goes against Trump, issues with cognition and all these other questions that, were the ones that Biden was getting hit with are now, targeted toward Trump. And, it remains to be seen whether Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita, Corey Lewandowski, who's back in the mix, if these people from previous campaigns can figure out that things have changed and they don't have an easy target like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's the open question right now, and I'm not seeing enough from the Trump campaign to suggest that they really understand how to meet the moment.
And I would add, and the perfect word is adroitness, that the ability of the Trump campaign to now find new avenues is really critical. The old line of attack is gone. That president isn't part of the mix, and yet Kamala Harris is, and they're going to have to adjust their message or they're going to be left behind here. So they've got some work here to get on with to really take Kamala Harris on.
All right, just to reset, as we're about at 3:25 here on the West Coast, we are looking at some of these live pictures with Chicago PD forming a line and a barricade against some of these Gaza war protesters that breached one of these fences in the security perimeter. Oh, wow, look at that line there. We've also been looking at some of the arrests that have been made. I'm not entirely sure about a number specifically, although several protesters have been arrested for breaching the fence. Now, Brian, AG, we've been covering the run-up to the DNC and what the preparations were like going into today and into the week here, and it was pretty locked down. There was a designated protest area for these Gaza war protesters, and from what we understand, the reporting from Fox 32 in Chicago, we watched it live, they breached some of that perimeter that was agreed to before the DNC got underway here. So, granted, it's nothing like 1968 today. No tear gas, nothing to that effect here, historically speaking. But it was definitely in the air going into today, as so many of these people were trying to make their voices heard. And I was seeing on social media and from Fox 32 in Chicago, not nearly as many protesters as they were expecting. Still, though, a pretty large, sizable contingent there outside of the United Center. But it looks like the police now kind of has this under control here. Look at this. We have police kind of climbing on the security perimeter to put it back into place here, it seems. And you can get a sense of how far back they are from the United Center as well. So, Brian, AG, I don't want to age you at all, but nothing to 1968 levels, at least yet. Brian.
Well, absolutely. I mean, historically speaking, you have protest groups at conventions. I've seen them. They're kept back. Sometimes they get through the first perimeter, but there are multiple lines of defense, if you want to phrase it that way. This looks pretty tepid to me in the bigger picture, because I've seen a lot worse. And historically, we've seen a lot worse. So protesting at a convention is de rigueur. That's what goes on every convention. This is heightened this year, of course, by the Palestinian situation, in the situation in Gaza. But these things oftentimes peter out as much as they gain steam. We'll just have to see where it goes over the next couple of days.
Yeah, of course, maybe they garnered enough energy and spent it all today. Don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. But does it underscore the point on the Gaza war that there are deep divisions within the party about support for Israel, support for the Palestinians? Do you think we're going to hear from a lot of speakers to that effect, AG and Brian? We know back in Milwaukee last month at the RNC that, Israel was mentioned so often. They prayed for the hostages. You heard from the family members and parents of some hostages. You heard from Jewish college students who witnessed some of the anti-Semitic incidents we've seen on college campuses here. How is it going to manifest itself inside the convention? We know how it's manifesting itself outside the convention. What do you think on that question, Brian?
Well, I think they are trying to emulate the Republican National Convention, which was tightly controlled It was thematic. The Dems have done the same thing. You know, the first night is for the people. The second night is a bold vision for America's future. The third night, a fight for our freedoms. And the fourth night, for our future. And I think that the Dems saw something in the Republican convention that was very convincing, and that is a tightly controlled convention sends out a very clear message about where you're coming from. And the Republicans did a wonderful job at their convention, and I think the Dems are trying to and will try to emulate it. So to your point, I don't know that you're going to see a lot of counter discussion, as it were, coming from speakers. If you've looked at the list, at least for day one, these are people who are going to get up there and talk about how wonderful the Democratic Party is and how great the messaging will be from the vice president. So I think it's going to be tightly controlled.
Yeah, you know, AJ, I was kind of curious, too, before we go to break here. Do you think there will be any explanation or any, for the sake of argument, rationale, an explanation to Democratic primary voters that, you didn't vote for Harris. You voted for Biden, 14 million of them here. Do you think we'll hear anything along those lines that, yes, everyone coalesced around Harris as the nominee, but that, and she said that she's going to earn it. Of course, she and Walz have been on the campaign stump in so many of these battleground states. But do you think there's a feeling within the Democratic Party, but also with undecideds and independents, that this was all done in a backdoor, smoke-filled room, and this is how we got here to this convention today, AG?
You know, I don't expect them to mention that at all on the convention floor.
Okay.
It's just not in the Democratic Party's interest to do so. The voters have moved on according to the surveys that we're seeing. And, like Brian says, it's basically about a cohesive narrative. And the narrative here is selling Kamala Harris and Tim Walz to the American people. I don't expect a lot of policy discussion writ large, definitely not anything like Israel or anything like that either. I think they're going to keep it, bold colors, simple messaging. I don't expect Kamala Harris to give a 90-minute acceptance speech, thank God. But I do honestly believe that they're just going to stay on message and on theme for this 4 days and hope that nothing derails.
All right, Brian, last thoughts here before we get into what we're told is going to be some of the speakers. The program's going to get started very, very soon here. Brian, final thoughts.
Oh, I agree with AG's last comments there. I think it's going to, stay within the lines, as it were. And I do think you're going to see a very controlled speech from Kamala Harris. If we recall the Republican convention, Donald Trump had about a 3,000-word speech and went on for 12,000 words. Under the heading of no political speech is too short, I think Kamala Harris will take a page out of that book and hit it hard and then move off the stage.
All right, Brian Sobel, A.G. Gankarski, can't thank you enough. Always great insight. We'll definitely be speaking soon.
Thank you.
Take care, Andrew. Have a great afternoon.